All right, so we're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff today, huh? Deonic logic, first-order logic, and modal logic, all from Wikipedia excerpts. Sounds intense, but I'm ready to uncover some seriously cool insights. You know I love a good logic puzzle.
Definitely. It might seem a little abstract at first, but trust me, these systems are more relevant than you might think. We're talking about how we reason, how we understand ethics, knowledge, even the very nature of reality. Heady stuff, right?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start with Deonic logic. The Wikipedia article describes it as, well, the logic of obligation, permission, those kinds of concepts. So basically, how do we formalize ought and may?
Exactly. It's like we're giving ourselves a symbolic language, a way to really analyze those should and can statements.
Yeah.
What are we obligated to do? What's allowed? What's absolutely forbidden?
And it's interesting, the article mentions that deontic comes from the ancient Greek for binding or proper.
Hmm.
Makes sense, given that we're dealing with right and wrong, or at least what's required and what's allowed.
Absolutely. And to do that analysis, we need symbols, right? So you'll see OA, meaning it is obligatory that A, and then PA for it is permitted that A.
So PA meaning A is okay, it's allowed, but we're not necessarily required to do it. Gotcha.
Exactly. Like it really gets at the nuance of permission. Think about it. Someone says, you may go to the zoo or the park. In everyday talk, we might think, okay, gotta pick one. But in deontic logic, that or, it's inclusive. You could do both. Go to the zoo and the park. It just clarifies those little distinctions that can be really important.
That's a great example. It shows how this logic stuff can actually help us be more precise with our language.
Yeah.
Avoid those misunderstandings, especially when we're talking about rules, ethics, things with real consequences.
Right. And it gets even more interesting when we throw in multiple people, multiple agents. Like imagine the statement, it is an obligation for Adam that Bob doesn't crash the car.
Okay, so Adam's got some responsibility there, making sure Bob drives safe.
Precisely. And we can represent that with notation like O with a little A underneath. C, where A is Adam, C is Bob doesn't crash the car. That subscript A is key. Shows it's Adam's obligation.
Ah, so that little subscript clears up who's responsible when we've got multiple people involved. Clever.
Exactly. No ambiguity there. Now, within deontic logic, there are different systems, each with its own rules. One of the most common is standard deontic logic, or SDL.
Ye article mentions it's also called KD or just D, and it uses this thing called crypt key semantics. Sounds pretty complex.
Right, but think of it like this. Kripke semantics, it's a framework for analyzing modal logic, which includes deontic logic, and it involves the idea of possible worlds.
Possible worlds, like alternate realities. I'm intrigued already.
Exactly. It's not just about what's true in our world, but about what could be true in other logically possible worlds. Like, what if things were different?
So it's exploring all those what ifs, seeing how truth might change depending on the scenario.
I like it. That's it. And in deontic logic, we use Kripke semantics to figure out are statements about obligation, permission, are they true, but relative to these possible worlds. And a key concept here is the accessibility relation between these worlds.
The article mentions that accessibility is interpreted as acceptability in deontic logic. So not just if a world is possible, but if it's acceptable according to the rules we're working with.
Right, like, is this world a good world, deontically speaking? Are obligations met? Are the rules followed? That's what makes it acceptable.
So an acceptable world, all obligations are fulfilled, no rules are broken. Sounds like a utopia.
You could say that. In SDL, it has specific axioms, kind of like rules, that govern these acceptability relations, telling us which worlds are the deontically ideal ones.
The article lists three main axioms for SDL: necessitation rule, modal axiom K, and modal axiom D. Let's break those down, shall we?
Sure, let's do it. The necessitation rule, it says if something's a tautology, always true, like A or not A, then it's also obligatory. So logical truths, they're deontically necessary too.
Makes sense. If it's logically undeniable, got to be obligatory in the system, right?
Right. Now, modal axiom K, this one says obligation distributes over implication. In simpler terms, if A implies B and A is obligatory, then B's got to be obligatory too.
Like a chain of obligations. If you're obligated to do something that leads to another action, you're obligated to do that resulting action as well.
Exactly. And last but not least, modal axiom D. This one states that obligation implies permission.
So if something's obligatory, it must also be permitted. That seems pretty intuitive. Can't require someone to do what's forbidden.
Makes sense, right? And speaking of forbidden, it's represented by FA, which can be defined as either not permitted A or obligatory not A.
Okay, so SDL gives us this foundation for understanding obligations, permissions, all that in a very precise, logically consistent way. But what about when things get a bit more, well, complicated?
That's where extensions of SDL come in. The Wikipedia article mentions a couple. One that relates to the classic idea, ought implies can.
You can't be obligated to do the impossible, right?
Yeah, exactly. To handle that, some extensions of SDL, they introduce an alephic modal operator. It represents necessity, but in a broader sense.
So we're not just talking about what the rules require, but what's actually possible, according to like the laws of physics, logic, that sort of thing.
Right on. So this extension helps us when an obligation might clash with what's achievable.
But wouldn't it be tough to figure out what's truly impossible, especially when we're talking about future events? It's not always clear-cut.
Absolutely. It's a huge philosophical challenge to judge those alephic possibilities, especially with the future involved. Things get really interesting when we start thinking about the limits of knowledge and prediction.
The article also talks about another extension to SDL, one that deals specifically with conditional obligations.
Yes. This is about those situations where the obligation only pops up under certain conditions. For instance, if you smoke, then you ought to use an ashtray.
Right, the obligation's conditional, depends on whether you're smoking or not. Makes sense.
Exactly. And to be precise, we need a special operator for that, OAB, meaning it is obligatory that A given B.
So much more nuanced than just saying you always have to use an ashtray, even if you're not smoking.
Precisely. It captures those real-world scenarios where the obligation is specific, not just a blanket statement.
This is all incredibly fascinating, but I'm curious, how do we actually determine if these statements about obligation and permission are true? How does the whole truth thing work in this world of deontic logic?
That's where Kripke semantics comes back in. Remember, we're evaluating these statements relative to possible worlds. And the accessibility relation, it's interpreted as an acceptability relation that we talked about.
Okay, so it's not just can we get to this world, but should we? Is it acceptable based on the rules of the system?
You got it. A world acceptable if all the obligations are met, no rules are broken. It's like the ideal scenario, ethically speaking.
The article mentions Anderson's deontic logic as well. Is that a different approach?
That's right. Anderson's system, it uses an alephic operator and a deontic constant to define obligation, so it ends up having different rules compared to SDL.
So different frameworks for formalizing these concepts, each with its own quirks and strengths. It's all starting to make sense, but I bet there's even more to uncover.
Oh, there's always more to explore, trust me. That's part of what makes logic so fascinating. Different ways to approach the same problem, leading to all sorts of interesting discussions. Okay, so we've unpacked deontic logic. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about first-order logic. It's also called predicate logic.
Yeah, and the Wikipedia article describes it as a more expressive system than good old propositional logic, the one that deals with simple declarative statements.
Right, exactly. Propositional logic, it's great for basic true or false stuff, but first-order logic goes deeper. We can actually break down those statements, see the individuals, properties, relationships, all that.
So instead of just saying Socrates is a philosopher, we're looking at Socrates the individual and then being a philosopher as a property.
Precisely. And by looking at that internal structure, first-order logic becomes way more powerful. We can express more complex ideas, reason about sets, functions, quantifiers, all sorts of things.
Quantifiers, yeah, the article mentions those as a key feature.
They're essential. Quantifiers let us talk about all or some members of a set, so you'll see two main ones. The universal quantifier, it's that upside down A symbol, meaning for all. And then the existential quantifier, a backwards E, meaning there exists.
So we can say things like, all men are mortal, or there exists a philosopher who is wise, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Those quantifiers, they just add so much more expressiveness to our logic language. We can make more general, precise statements about the world.
And then there's predicates, another big part of first-order logic.
Absolutely crucial. Predicates, they're the expressions that denote properties or relationships. Like in that example, Socrates is a philosopher. Is a philosopher part, that's the predicate. It's expressing something about Socrates.
So predicates connect individuals to their properties or even to other individuals, showing relationships.
Exactly. They're the glue that holds everything together, lets us build those complex statements that capture how the world works, with all its relationships and attributes and stuff.
Okay, so to recap, first-order logic, it takes propositional logic and supercharges it with these new tools. Individuals, predicates, quantifiers. Suddenly we can talk about so much more.
And that's why it's the basis for so many fields: mathematics, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, you name it. First-order logic is everywhere.
Okay, on to our third type of logic today, Modal logic. Now, this one sounds particularly intriguing.
It really is. Modal logic, it takes us beyond just stating facts. We're talking about possibilities, necessities, those what-if scenarios, the things that must be true, might be true, or even could have been true. It gets pretty deep, pretty fast.
Yeah, the Wikipedia article describes it as formalizing those what if and always ideas. It's like we're trying to capture all those different ways we think about possibilities.
Exactly. And to do that, we've got modal operators. The box, or, represents necessity, while the diamond, or, stands for possibility.
So, or A would mean A is necessarily true, like it's true in every possible world. And then or A means A is possibly true, so there's at least one world out there where A holds true.
You got it. It's all about exploring those different possible worlds, seeing how truth might change depending on the world we're in. And the cool thing is, modal logic, it applies to so many areas. Epistemic logic, which is about knowledge and belief, deontic logic, which we already talked about, even temporal logic, which is all about time and how things change over time.
It's amazing how these symbols, they can have such a huge impact on how we understand so many different aspects of thinking and reasoning.
Modal logic is powerful stuff. It really helps us dig into those nuances of possibility, necessity, knowledge, time, the works. It's like a key to unlocking a deeper understanding of how we make sense of the world.
So how do we actually use modal logic? I mean, how do we determine if a statement is true or not? The article mentions something called relational semantics.
Right, relational semantics. Remember those possible worlds we talked about? Well, in relational semantics, we use those, along with something called an accessibility relation, to figure out if a modal statement is true.
Okay, so we're back to evaluating statements based on these different worlds and whether they're accessible from a given starting point.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The accessibility relation, it can mean different things depending on what kind of logic we're dealing with. It's not always about acceptability, like in deontic logic.
So, for example, with temporal logic, the accessibility relation would be about time, right? Like which worlds are temporally accessible from a particular world, what happened in the past, what could happen in the future.
That's a great example. And in epistemic logic, which deals with knowledge, the accessibility relation would represent what's consistent with an agent's knowledge. A world is accessible if the agent can't rule it out based on what they know.
So if I know the Earth is round, then every world I consider, every accessible world, the Earth has got to be round in those worlds too.
Precisely. And if I don't know if it'll snow tomorrow, well, some accessible worlds will have snow, some won't. It all depends on what the agent knows.
This accessibility relation, it seems super important for making sense of modal logic.
It is. It captures this idea that truth, for modal statements at least, it's relative. It depends on the context, the possible worlds, and how they're connected. The choice of accessibility relation, that's a big deal. It determines what's true or false in a particular model.
The article mentions the valuation function too, something about assigning truth values to basic formulas in each world.
Right, think of it like setting the stage for each world. The valuation function, it tells us which basic facts are true in that specific world.
And then, using the modal operators and the accessibility relation, we can figure out if more complex modal statements are true based on those basic facts.
You got it. It's all connected. Possible worlds, the accessibility relation, the valuation function, all working together to analyze modal statements. It's a beautiful system, really.
Okay, but let's get specific. How do we actually figure out if a modal statement is true in this whole framework? Can you give us an example?
Sure, let's take necessity, Ari. That statement, it's true in a given world if A is true in all the worlds accessible from that world.
So, necessarily, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. That's true in our world if, in every accessible world, water boils at 100 degrees at sea level.
Exactly. And for possibility, Ari, that's true in a world if A is true in at least one accessible world.
So, possibly I'll win the lottery tomorrow. That's true now if there's even one accessible world out there where I'm holding that winning ticket.
Precisely. It all comes down to the accessibility relation, which worlds are connected and what's true in those worlds.
This is starting to click. So that accessibility relation really shapes what we consider necessary or possible, doesn't it?
100%. And different accessibility relations lead to different systems of modal logic, each with its own way of looking at necessity and possibility. It gets pretty diverse pretty quickly.
Speaking of different systems, the article mentions the concept of frames. What are those exactly?
Frames, they're like the blueprints for modal systems. They're relational models, but without the valuation function. So we're just looking at how the worlds are connected, the structure of the accessibility relation, regardless of what specific facts are true in each world.
So it's the pure logic, the structure of the system before we fill in the details. I like it.
That's it. And different modal logic systems, they're defined using different frame conditions, which are rules that constrain the accessibility relation in specific ways.
The article lists some of those conditions. Reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity, seriality, Euclidean. That's a lot of defettis. What do they all mean in this context?
These conditions, they describe properties of the accessibility relation, and that shapes the whole modal system. So reflexivity, that means every world is accessible from itself. Systems with reflexivity, they basically accept that if something's true, it's also necessarily true.
That makes sense. If A is true in a world, and that world can access itself, well, then A is true in all accessible worlds, so it must be necessary.
Exactly. Then there's symmetry. Symmetry means if world U is accessible from world W, then world W is also accessible from world U. It's a two-way street.
So if you can get from W to U, you can get back from U to W as well.
Precisely. And then transitivity, that means if U is accessible from W and V is accessible from U, then V is also accessible from W, like a chain of accessibility.
So if we get from W to U and from U to V, we can jump straight from W to V. Got it.
Exactly. These frame conditions, they define the shape of the accessibility relation, and that in turn determines what inferences are valid, what theorems we can prove in that particular modal logic system.
The article mentions a whole bunch of systems, KD, TD, S4, S5. I guess each one has a different combination of these frame conditions leading to different logical rules.
You got it. These are some of the big names in modal logic, each with its own set of axioms and theorems, reflecting the specific way their accessibility relations are structured. It's like a whole family of logics, each with its own personality.
Wow. So understanding those frame conditions is really key to understanding the differences between these systems.
Absolutely. They give us a formal way to characterize how possible worlds can be connected, leading to this rich and fascinating landscape of modal logics, each capturing different aspects of necessity and possibility.
This is all so incredibly fascinating, but I gotta admit, it's a lot to take in. We've covered so much about modal logic already. Possible worlds, accessibility relations, these frame conditions. But before we jump to axiomatic systems, is there anything else you want to emphasize about relational semantics?
I think the key takeaway here is that relational semantics, it's just so powerful, so flexible. By thinking about these different worlds and how they're connected, we can model all sorts of modal concepts, from simple possibility and necessity to really complex stuff about knowledge, time, obligation, you name it.
So we've been using this relational semantics to understand modal logic, all about possible worlds and how they connect. But the Wikipedia article, it also mentions axiomatic systems as another way to work with these logics.
Right, exactly. Axiomatic systems, they're kind of a different angle. Instead of thinking about truth in terms of those possible worlds, we focus on the rules for manipulating formulas, how we derive theorems within the system. It's more about the syntax, the structure of the language.
So less about what the statements mean, more about how we can play with them, move them around, like a game with very specific rules.
That's a good way to put it, like focusing on the grammar instead of the dictionary definitions. We start with axioms. Those are statements we just accept as true. And then we have rules of inference, ways to get new true statements from the ones we already have.
And I see those familiar names again, KT, S4, S5D, but this time they're presented as axiomatic systems.
Right. So for example, system K, it's one of the most basic modal systems, and it's usually defined by adding this axiom K and the necessitation rule on top of the regular propositional logic stuff.
And the other systems, they basically build on K by adding more axioms, making the logic stronger, able to prove more stuff.
Precisely. Like system T, it adds axiom T, which says if something's necessary, it's also got to be true. System S4 adds axiom 4, which is about, like, if something's necessary, it's necessarily necessary. It gets a bit meta, I know.
Yeah, but it's interesting how those axioms, they reflect these assumptions about what necessity and possibility really mean.
Totally. Each axiom adds a new constraint on how we reason about these modal ideas, shaping what we can conclude within that system. It's like adding new rules to the game, changing how it's played.
The article points out that these axioms in the axiomatic systems, they connect back to those frame conditions we talked about in relational semantics.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's one of the coolest things about logic, how the syntax and semantics are intertwined. Like axiom T in the axiomatic system, it corresponds to the reflexivity condition in relational semantics. It all comes together.
So axiom T, which says if it's necessary, it must be true, that lines up with the idea that every world can access itself in the relational model. It's like two ways of saying the same thing, but with different tools.
Exactly. And axiom 4, the one about necessary necessity, that matches up with the transitivity condition in relational semantics. It's really neat how these two approaches, axiomatic and relational, they're just different perspectives on the same underlying concepts.
Like two sides of the same coin, each giving us a slightly different view, but ultimately it's the same coin. I love that analogy.
It's a good one. By studying both approaches, we get a richer understanding of modal logic as a whole. We see how those abstract rules of inference, they relate to the ideas of possible worlds and accessibility relations, which maybe are a bit more intuitive.
Before we get too philosophical, though, I do want to touch on those extensions within deontic logic. The Wikipedia article lists some interesting ones. Non-monotonic, paraconsistent, dynamic, hyper-intentional, lots of big words there.
Yeah, those are all areas of active research, trying to handle those really tricky bits of reasoning about obligation and permission. They go beyond the standard STL stuff, trying to capture how ethics actually works in the messy real world.
So they're like specialized tools for dealing with particularly difficult problems in deontic logic.
That's a good way to think about it. Like non-monotonic deontic logic that deals with situations where our knowledge about obligations is incomplete, or maybe it changes as we learn new stuff.
Oh, that makes sense. It's like our understanding of rules and duties. It can evolve, right?
Yeah.
As we get more information, we might have to revise what we thought was obligatory.
Exactly. Our ethical reasoning, it's not always based on perfect knowledge. Non-monotonic logic, it helps us model that we might have to adjust our judgments as we go.
And paraconsistent deontic logic. What's that one about?
Paraconsistent logic, that's a fun one. It's all about handling those cases where we have conflicting obligations. Like, when you're pulled in two directions, two obligations that seem to contradict each other. It happens all the time in real life.
All the time. It's like those classic ethical dilemmas. No matter what you choose, someone's going to be unhappy.
Right. In normal logic, a contradiction, it breaks everything. But in paraconsistent logic, we can actually reason about those conflicts without the whole system falling apart. It's much more flexible, able to deal with the messiness of ethical dilemmas.
So it's a logic that can handle the fact that our moral lives are rarely black and white. There's always that gray area.
Exactly. And then there's dynamic deontic logic. That one focuses on how obligations change over time as actions happen. So it models how our duties evolve as we make choices, interact with the world, cause things to happen.
So like a logic for tracking the consequences of our actions, how those actions create new obligations or maybe dissolve old ones.
Precisely. It's a really powerful way to look at scenarios where the ethical landscape is shifting, constantly changing because of what people do.
And lastly, we have hyperintentional deontic logic. What's that one all about?
Hyperintentional logic, it's a bit more technical, but basically it's about those subtle distinctions between propositions that might have the same truth value, but they mean different things or they're presented in different ways. So in deontic logic, it lets us distinguish between obligations that might look the same on the surface, but have different justifications, different reasons behind them.
So two obligations might lead to the same action, but why we're obligated, the reasoning behind it, that could be totally different. And that difference, it might actually matter ethically.
Exactly. Hyperintentional deontic logic, it lets us be more sensitive to those subtle nuances of meaning and intention that are often so important in ethical reasoning.
It's amazing how these extensions to deontic logic, they give us the tools to grapple with all these different ethical challenges, all these complexities that come up in real life. It's not just about simple rules anymore. It's about how those rules interact and change in different contexts.
Absolutely. And just like deontic logic has these fascinating extensions, modal logic itself, it offers a whole world of variations and alternative approaches.
Yeah, the Wikipedia article on modal logic mentions something called topological semantics as another way to understand and interpret modal statements. What's that all about?
Topological semantics, it's inspired by topology, which is a branch of mathematics that studies the properties of spaces, how they behave under continuous transformations. It's a different way to think about those modal statements, a different kind of model.
So instead of possible worlds, we're dealing with spaces and shapes and transformations. That sounds pretty abstract.
It is abstract, but it's a really elegant approach. The basic idea is to interpret those modal statements in terms of open and closed sets within a topological space. Open sets, think of them like neighborhoods within a space. And then we evaluate modal statements based on how those neighborhoods overlap or don't overlap.
Okay, can you give me an example that makes sense? A real world example.
Sure. Imagine you're in a city And the city is the topological space. The neighborhoods, those are the open sets. And let's say you're thinking possibly there's a park nearby.
So I'm at a certain spot in the city, and I'm wondering if there's a park within a certain distance, like within my neighborhood.
Exactly. In topological semantics, that statement would be true if your neighborhood, the open set you're in, overlaps with the set of all parks in the city.
So it's like checking if my neighborhood intersects with the area on a map where all the parks are.
That's a great way to visualize it. And if you were to say, necessarily there's a streetlight nearby, that would be true if every neighborhood around you, every open set containing your location, also contains a streetlight.
So like checking if my neighborhood is completely within the area on the map where all the streetlights are.
You got it. Topological semantics, it just gives us a different but powerful way to interpret those modal statements. And it has some advantages, especially when we're dealing with what are called non-normal modal logics.
The article mentions that non-normal modal logics. What are those?
Well, normal modal logics, like the ones we've been talking about, they follow those standard axioms like the distribution axiom K and the necessitation rule. Those capture some pretty fundamental intuitions about necessity and possibility.
But sometimes those axioms, they don't quite work.
Yeah, there are some systems where those standard axioms, they lead to weird conclusions, stuff that doesn't really make sense. Like in logics of belief, the distribution axiom, it might not hold up. Believing A and believing that A implies B, that doesn't always mean you believe B. Our beliefs, they're not always perfectly logical or consistent.
Right. Yeah, we're not perfect logical machines. Our beliefs can be messy, contradictory sometimes.
Exactly. Topological semantics, it's flexible enough to handle those non-normal logics. It lets us explore systems that capture how we actually reason, even if it's not always perfectly aligned with those standard axioms.
So it's a way to model the messiness, the inconsistencies, the gray areas of how we think.
That's a great way to put it. And it's been really useful for things like epistemic logic, where we can model how our beliefs change, how we handle evidence, and how we justify our beliefs. It gets really interesting really fast.
Wow, this whole deep dive, it's been quite a journey. We've covered so much. Deontic logic, modal logic, relational semantics, axiomatic systems, all these different extensions and variations. It's a lot to absorb, but it's also incredibly fascinating.
It is a lot, but hopefully it's been an enjoyable kind of brain workout. And remember, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore in logic, all these different systems and applications and philosophical rabbit holes to go down.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but it's definitely been inspiring. I'm definitely going to keep learning about logic, how it can help us understand language, reasoning, of the world around us. It's like a whole new way of seeing things.
I'm so glad to hear that. Logic, it might seem abstract, but it really can help us clarify our thinking, make better decisions, navigate the world with more precision and understanding. It's a powerful tool once you start to see how it works.
This deep dive has definitely been an eye-opener for me. Thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through all this fascinating stuff.
It's been my pleasure. Keep exploring, keep those logical minds engaged. There's a whole world of fascinating ideas out there waiting to be discovered.